Great. So as you can see from my title slide, we'll be talking today, and I'll be sharing some of my research and enthusiasms about the practice of hair work in Vermont collections, mostly in the 19th century, and bringing that into also conversation about contemporary artists who are using hair as a medium in their artistic practice. And so the talk will be split about half and half between those two themes. So you're seeing kind of an emblematic image from both bookends of the talk. And this is maybe an obvious point, but I think it's worth repeating and bearing in mind that in almost any historical consideration and kind of humanistic inquiry, we are working with and talking about and thinking through the things that have survived, the things that have been handed down to us that someone who had the resources to keep them safe, who treasured them, handed them down to posterity, whether they be in libraries or local historical societies, museum collections, or even family attics. And so the kind of objects I'll be talking about tonight are kind of quirky, amazing works mostly by upper middle class and middle class American women, white women who had enough resources to have the free time to make these amazing works of art and craft. So when I'm talking about the historical objects, these are the kind of materials that have been passed down and saved. In many instances, a lot of these works have been lost in the ensuing decades, or the kind of written materials that might have linked information that we have about the makers and creators have been separated from the works that we have. I'm showing you on the screen one of my favorite pictures of hair work and Vermont material culture, a kind of icon of Vermont material culture, Lillian Baker Carlisle, shown here in a photograph from the 1970s with an enormous hairwork wreath. This is really atypical. Most of them, like the one you see on the right, are only about 24 inches, 20 or 24 inches tall. And this one that Lillian Baker Carlisle is posing with is almost the same size as her. But again, these were works that were really prized at one point in their makers' lives, and in many instances were kind of discarded or seen as out of fashion or even kind of gross. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts about both the historical practice and the kind of contemporary associations with it. Part of this, I think, comes about when we think about the anthropologist Mary Douglas, who has talked about sociological ideas about and attitudes towards dirt and disarray. And she talks about dirt as being something that is matter out of place or matter out of order. So you may have a lot of affection and adoration for the hair of your loved one when it's on their head, but when you see it in the bathroom sink, not as cool. And so those kind of sensations, those human reactions of adoration, revulsion, the desire for proximity and closeness are part of what will animate a lot of the makers we'll be talking about tonight. A lot of this research grows out of a class I was able to teach last January when we were on lockdown. This Zoom screen probably is very familiar to you guys. I was really grateful to Middlebury's Center for Community Engagement for helping to underwrite the class and have us do activities like a session with Karen Bachman, who's an amazing jeweler and artist who teaches at the Pratt Institute, and who has amassed an incredible collection of hair work, past and present, and also guided my students in creating works of hair work ourselves. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of the materiality involved in making these amazing works and what they help us to see. So as I mentioned, most of the 19th century examples of hair work that I will be talking about tonight were created by wealthy or middle-class white women who had enough leisure time and kind of disposable income and resources to devote to making these incredibly labor-intensive, time-consuming works of art. And they were mostly made in and for the domestic interior. So on the left, I'm showing you a view of kind of a typical parlor of the American upper middle class home, with women there working on their handicrafts. You see a woman doing some maybe Berlin work, some embroidery, and you can get a sense of the kind of very elaborate interior in which these were created and in which they were displayed. So women, and this was usually a practice done by women, would gather locks of hair of family members, loved ones, family circle, close friends, and they often created these artifacts when family members might be moving away. If someone got married, for example, and was moving to a new home, to a new town, you can think of this as a kind of materialization of a kinship network or a family tree, with all of these, each individual blossom, and they are often in these kind of flower-like forms, created from the hair of an identified family member. And this materializing and giving the person who's moving away a way of carrying a piece of that person and this beautiful family tree with them. And instead of having then that messy scrapbook of hair that Mary Douglas might have warned us about, we have these carefully controlled, beautifully composed groupings of flowers, of floral arrangements in this instance. A lot of people talk about hair work as potentially being about mourning, about grief, and the kind of aftermath or attempts to cope with the death of a loved one. And in some instances, that was the motivating force, but often they were also ways for women of the period to demonstrate their aesthetic skills, their learning, their sense of kind of self-control and order, not just those small motor skills, but of design and aesthetic appreciation, in addition to having this material evocation of the family network or kinship ties more broadly. So you're seeing a close-up here of this beautiful floral arrangement made of hair by Emma Adele Myrick, who was growing up near Addison County and probably created this around 1860 when she married and moved out of her family home. Like I said, my class was really lucky to take a workshop with Karen Bachman. And so I'm giving you a sense here. This was my desk set up for when we did our experiments with Gimp Work, as this is called, whose primary tools are a knitting needle, as you can see there. We used horsehair, but this would have been kind of the precious family locks of the hair of friends and family members at the time, and copper wire. And so, as I hope you can see in my very amateur creations on the right, the hair is looped around the knitting needle and held in place by a series of twisted wires. And then that is in turn twisted and turned and sculpted into these flower-like forms. So it's an immensely laborious, time-consuming process that in some ways you can achieve kind of a meditative state in which you are going through the kind of repeated motions of forming those loops and crossing the wires, forming the loops and crossing the wires, that could give you a moment or an opportunity to kind of meditate on your connection to this far-flung person. The class also benefited from a virtual tour to Nancy Ravenel's conservation lab at the Shelburne Museum in Shelburne, Vermont, up Route 7 from us in Middlebury. And this will also give you a chance to see some of the really wonderful detailed work as done by expert practitioners from the 19th century. So this is a magnified examination of one of these 19th century floral works. So you can get a better sense, I think, of that kind of repetitive looping nature of this work. The length of hair that you would have needed in order to sculpt some of these longer flowers. So the kind of benefiting from the long hair of many women and hairstyles in this period. Momentarily lost my cursor. There we go. So here's my class and some guests showing off our creations with horsehair and wire. But I want us to, this is also provided a really great impetus for us to dive into research projects about the work in Vermont collections, surviving artifacts of hairwork in the collections of the Sheldon Museum, Rokeby, the Davis Family Library Special Collections at Middlebury College, and the Shelburne Museum as well. So we thought a lot about the practices of hairwork, both how it was originally done, what it meant in terms of kind of social life and aesthetic life for people of the period. And then we also tried to do some archival research to dig up some of the stories about the women who made these incredible works. And as a little bit of background, I'm showing you here also the frontispiece to a book by a gentleman named Mark Campbell, published in 1867, an instructor, self-instructor in the art of hairwork that was supposed to help teach kind of a correspondence course for people to learn how to make this hair jewelry themselves. And he is seated here with what was understood as a table for making table worked hair. And it has a lot in common actually with lace making and with bobbins. So he's at this round table, and instead of the strands of thread and tied to bobbins that you would usually have for lace, those are individual, or in some cases, strands of 3 or 4 hairs tied together. And the book is full of these very elaborate patterns for striped snake chain beads, as you see here. You can get a sense on the right of how elaborate this kind of weaving was. So these include circular diagrams for how you would lay out your hair with its bobbins around your circular table. And then he explained the ways in which you would lay over and under your different strands of hair to make these incredibly elaborate chains in many instances, chains or loops or other forms of hair jewelry. These were also published in Godey's Lady's Book in the 1850s. And they result in, as you can see here, a wide variety of really intricate braids and loops that look almost like ropes. This example is by an unknown maker, a watch from the collection of the Henry Sheldon Museum. And it also gives me a chance to say happy birthday to my mom, Linda Foutch. It's February 2nd is her birthday. And so thanks to this being on Zoom, we can spend a little time together tonight. So, but again, these materials were ways of reinforcing and reinscribing familial ties and kinship ties, of bringing together people who were separated by time and space and distance, and done in these really elaborate, beautifully wrought forms. Of course, in some instances, this kind of work would be too complicated, in which case you could send off your loved one's hair or your own hair to have it made into a ready-to-order piece of jewelry or a sentimental object. This is a page from Menga's Ornamental Hairwork. This was a company based in New York that had a whole booklet array of designs that you could choose from. And all of these patterns, again, are done with table worked hair. And I'm comparing that to a brooch in the collection of the Sheldon Museum. So you can get a sense of that kind of hollow work design that helped to create these really intricate, almost textile-like works. And so these objects they could be both objects designed to be displayed in the domestic sphere in one of those parlors that I showed you before, like this elaborate hair wreath, or an object that would be worn on the body of materials from the body, often worn close to the heart. And so we have this necklace of table worked hair and beads formed into beads and a cross, also in the collection of the Sheldon Museum, and sadly now separated from the name of its maker. There were also many practices of materializing these kinds of extended family relationships and friendships that were much smaller and perhaps even more intimate. And I'm showing you here this book from Ursula Hatch of Ferrisburgh, Vermont. I love how here it's Ferrisburgh with a PH. And young Ursula created this album probably, again, around the time of her marriage. You see her at the frontispiece where she's cut out possibly a fashion plate to decorate that front cover page. And then within the album, there's page after page of carefully looped and arranged locks of hair, often nestled behind these really intricate interwoven paper crafts. So you're seeing here Ursula's hair work in the upper right and a lock of hair from her husband, Isaac, on the upper left, all brought together. And most family members, the age at which the lock of hair has been taken is noted. The pages usually have kind of color coordinated works as well with that intricate paper. And there are other objects too that materialize family trees in almost literal ways. For example, this shadow box hairwork floral tree by Abigail Foster Wood at the Shelburne Museum up the road. And the verso, which you're seeing on the right, she's inscribed in this painstakingly faint fountain pen ink the names of every person included in this delicate tree. This gives you a closer up view of each blossom and carefully worked aspect of the tree. And this was made, as we can see in the inscriptions, Abigail F. Wood to her sister Diana, and the bottom has labeled 1857, the year in which she made this. And so thanks to this really extensive record keeping, we can reconstruct those family trees as well and identify which family it is. We can see the ways in which Abigail Foster Wood, who had moved to Canada in Quebec with her family, was still maintaining family ties with her sister who lived outside of Montpelier. I love that even though they are living these kind of separate lives, they have these very similar gravestones that they've selected with the almost horseshoe-like shape. The ways in which Abigail Foster Wood's chain that decorates the center of her gravestone evokes the loops and twirls and intertwined works of those Gimp worked flowers and designs as well. And because of this archival research, we could see that Abigail and Diana's mother, Mary King Foster, passed away in 1857. And so that is likely the impetus for Abigail's making of this really delicate, beautiful object. Archival research lets us track down a portrait of Abigail Foster Wood so that we can see what this young woman looked like. This was probably a marriage portrait done in the 1830s, so some 25 years before the Floral Tree. But we can really appreciate that how attuned she is to aesthetics in that really elaborate hairstyle that she is posed with for her portrait, in addition to the really delicate floral tree. So these what sometimes look like very modest works turn out to have incredible stories that they are waiting to tell us if we have the time and attention to give them. And if those archival records that I mentioned have been safeguarded through the years and kind of kept with these sometimes, again, modest looking artifacts. This is a really small brooch from the Martin Missionary collection, which is part of the Middlebury College special collections. On the left, you have a close-up view so you can get a sense of how the hair is braided together. It's gold setting and that beautiful rope-like detail around the edge that again evokes the ways in which the hair, loops of hair are linked and roped and woven together. And on the right, our special collections, Director of Special Collections, Rebecca Irwin, is holding it in the palm of her hand. So you can get a sense of the scale and that kind of intimacy. And when we dig into the archival record, we realize that this has a really striking story that speaks actually to kind of global exchange and ultimately heartbreak. The Martin Missionary collection reveals to us that Mary Elizabeth Martin, seen in the center here, and her husband, Carlos Roscoe Martin, were missionaries from Vermont who went to China in the 1860s. They took their family and packed up, went across the country to San Francisco, and then sailed to Hong Kong and then Foochow, the Methodist mission there. And on the far right, you're seeing a picture from the family album that was inscribed Lucius Martin with his Chinese nurse from around 1864 again. And Carlos and Mary Elizabeth Martin had a very active life in the mission. He was translating a lot of works, giving a lot of sermons, very active in an expatriate community in Foochow. And unfortunately, like many 19th century people, succumbed to cholera. Both Carlos, who is referred to as Carly by his wife, and little Lucius, who you see here, contracted cholera and died in 1864, leaving Mary Elizabeth Martin bereft. And as part of trying to figure out what to do with or how to cope with this grief, she likely commissioned this hairwork brooch as something that she could bring her husband and her young son with her always. This was part of the tragedy and kind of drama of 19th century life, and especially missionary life, leaving the grave sites of loved ones and not being able to visit them anymore. And so as part of that practice, she commissioned the brooch. She commissioned this beautiful soapstone monument that she could have kind of a portable tomb to take with her to remember them by. And she herself collected plants growing near their grave sites, and also asked friends on visits back to this cemetery to collect plants to kind of carry some of that with her. So you see this scrapbook that includes cedar and woodbine collected from the grave sites of her husband and son. Here, cypress from dear Carly's and Lucius's grave in the Mission Cemetery. So there are these ways in which these really seemingly humble objects carry these stories of heartbreak and connection across the centuries to us now. But of course, hair has a lot of other loaded meanings that are embedded in it and that get kind of replicated throughout American culture. I'm showing you here a work from the Art Institute of Chicago by this collective called Bless, the Bless Beauty Hairbrush, which I think really succinctly evokes some of the kind of impossible beauty standards that are so quickly evoked by hair. Any discussion of it. We might also think of myths of Rapunzel, for example, of the kind of impossibility of attaining idealized beauty. And in recent decades, many artists have turned to hair as a means of thinking through and with and probing and problematizing in ways these beauty ideals and questions of kind of feminine identity, of American identity, of ethnic identity, and more. So I'm going to start us in terms of thinking of this with the work of the artist Janine Antoni and her performance Loving Care from the 1990s, in which she, yes, indeed, Loving Care, the title is a reference to Clairol's hair dye. She obtained a bucket in which she mixed Clairol's natural black hair dye and dipped her head into that bucket, making her head almost like a paintbrush, this mark-making device in which she painted the gallery floor, moving from one end of the gallery to the other. You can see here the other visitors to the gallery kind of being backed away as she does this elaborate mark making that really takes up space, but also evokes both, I think, histories of domestic labor, the evocation of kind of mopping the floor, but in this instance, filling it with marks rather than cleaning it. And also ideas about female beauty and the desire for the appearance of youth, what it means to have a hair dye that is called natural black, those evocations of loving care, of domesticity, affection, all rolled up into this work. And she's also responding in many ways to the kind of archaeology of American painting and of modernism. This work that's on the floor, that's about taking up space, I think is in many ways a direct engagement with the really famous representations of the artist Jackson Pollock with his drip paintings, captured in photographs by Hans Nemeth and others, dripping his paint dramatically across the canvas, crossing the floor of his studio or his barn, with this elaborate, dramatic, action-filled mark making that really upended ideas about what painting, what modernist painting, what art could and should be. And so I think Janine Antoni's work is this really amazing, clever engagement with that work that also recenters questions of feminine identity, of the roles of women in culture, in society, in the home, in the mirror, in her work as well. A very different kind of mark making is evoked by the contemporary artist Melanie Belinker. I'm showing you here this brooch series in which these delicate, intimate line drawings are done not with the tip of a pen or with thread, but rather the lines are made with hair. These are really delicate kind of line drawings that in this instance are again turned into jewelry, like so many of those brooches that we've seen. But in this instance, I love that it's a woman who is, there's a very self-reflexive part of it. She's shown arranging her hair. It is made of hair. It's this intimate moment. The front and back of the brooch show the front and back of each pose or posture. So this kind of delicate rendering that is a very different kind of working with hair than what we've seen. So that you can see some of these details of the nude studies as well here. And at this point, I'd like to pivot to the work of Sonia Clarke, who is maybe more directly engaging some of the fancy work practices that we've been talking about, with using hair as a textile, as a medium in that way. And so I'm going to shift to showing some of the work that she herself has made, to show a short video of her talking about her artistic practice, because it so beautifully evokes much of the work that she's doing here. So this is the artist Sonia Clarke speaking from her studio in a video produced by the Gibbs Museum of South Carolina.
So one of the things that I've been doing for a long time is thinking about textiles in terms of their connection to hair. So a lot of my work is related to hair and textiles and the bridge between those two. Lots and lots of hair references. In fact, a friend of mine cut her hair, and I actually used her hair to make a piece in the last show. It's not just her hair, it's her. And then I like to think of it even beyond that, that if it's her DNA, then it's all the people who came before her that are written in her DNA. So it's powerful stuff, hair. So I have to be very careful about, or think very consciously about whose hair I use and how and why. The question of why I use hair in my work, it's such a potent material. It is our actual physical human DNA. So it's a ready-made portraiture. It's also a place in which we, in this country, still negotiate race. So this is something that we keep around in the studio because it's sort of the little wig template. And it was on a piece like this, or perhaps this piece that I figured out the cornrows and the Bantu knots for the black hair flag piece. And the thread was all made out of cotton. The battle flag of the Confederacy was painted on canvas, and then it was stitched just like this, and the cornrows and then the Bantu knots are what make the American flag on the surface. So in this case, it's not that I'm using hair, it's that I'm using hair styling techniques and thread to refer back to African and African American identity. So there's this long, rich tradition of working with hair across the globe and through many cultures. And I just like to think that I'm part of that continuation of that conversation. This is a bow that is re-haired with human hair. This one that looks quite gray is made with my hair. All three races are implied because the blonde hair is actually not from a European person. It's from an Asian person, and then the hair has been bleached blonde. There's this other thing just about the prize being drawn around the circle of being a Southern artist.
So I'm going to pause it here. That was made when Sonia Clarke was working in Richmond, Virginia. She is now a professor at Amherst College, just down the road. So I'll go back to my slideshow here. In her practice, Sonia Clarke is in many ways engaging with traditions of using hair as a medium of artistic expression. And she's also reinventing it in these really exciting ways. And she also is foregrounding her own identity as a Black woman, and the ways in which Blackness is or is not visible in art museums, in American culture more broadly, and emphasizing those kind of kinship ties as well. I think her black hair flag is a really remarkable and important piece, especially as we are thinking through the place of flags and symbols in American culture, the ways in which she is asserting the Black presence and amidst the complicated history of the United States and the Confederacy, by also using cotton, a fraught medium as well. She is asserting the Americanness of African American and Black American culture with those cornrows and the Bantu knots that are so still imbricated and interwoven with the history of the Confederacy and these painful histories of racism and oppression and white supremacy. In a very different way, Althea Murphy Price is employing hair and as a medium, and one that also bringing together, in this instance, not hair and cotton, but hair and sugar, one of the main products of enslaved labor, and so many years motivating the triangle trade for the Atlantic world and slavery. But here, Althea Murphy Price is bringing together shaved hair, bits of shaved clippings, and sugar in this instance. And she's filtering them through lace or doily kind of screens to make these beautiful decorative patterns on the floor. And they're also almost like mandalas or sand paintings. They aren't affixed to the floor with any kind of glue or fixative material, so they have the potential to be very ephemeral and delicate and can almost blow away if they're walked by too rapidly, for instance. So this really interesting, I think, inversion of the idea of the decoration of the domestic sphere that we saw with hairwork wreaths, instead evoking, again, like I said, oriental rugs or kind of wallpaper patterns in some ways. So I've brought in a short description that she's described this practice with as well. And in some instances, she's using clippings from barbershops, which of course evokes another atmosphere of sociality and kinship and engagement. And some instances, she's using imported hair, which brings up, again, different questions about kind of the global trade in hair and beauty standards and commodities as well. And in closing, as the kind of last artist I'd like to talk about tonight, I would like to bring in the work of the artist Lauren Schwartz, who is based in New Orleans, and especially in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. She came across the ruins of a beauty shop, St. Claude Beauty Supply Shop, that was having to, because of the destruction of the storm, basically dump almost their entire inventory. And it included a large pile of hair extensions and hair weaves. And Lauren Schwartz took these really evocative works that are usually used to amplify one's beauty, and she has sculpted them into these beautiful evocations of the people in the city of New Orleans, usually creating structures, portraits in some ways of actual buildings that were disrupted, destroyed, or damaged by Hurricane Katrina. And in this way is doing this really beautiful weaving together of the people of the city, in some instances who had to leave, not to return, and the changed place, this evocation of beauty in pain through these three-dimensional structures using hair extensions as her medium. And she's also done a series of beads that you see on the right, an installation view that to me evokes the way that Mardi Gras beads are sometimes flung or caught on the branches of trees after the Mardi Gras parade. So again, this kind of evocation of joy, of loss, of community that also in some ways evokes those 19th century hairwork necklaces and pieces of jewelry that we've seen that are so much about intimacy and connection rather, and personal connections. So I think at this moment, I will stop my screen share and open it up to a Q&A, if that works for you guys.
We have one question from Holly in South Carolina, and she's asking if there's a way for her to send a photo. It's a framed cut art silhouette with hair-like blonde background, and she's curious about your thoughts.
I would love to see it. I think you can find my email address really easily. I don't know if there's the option to upload attachments in the chat. Sometimes that can happen, but I'm not sure if that's enabled right now. But it's my first initial and my last name at middlebury.edu. If you want to send, we can start a pen pal.
Okay. There's also, let me get into the Q&A. Carla says, we tend to frame the making of hair work and other feminine pastimes in terms of precious, memory, and meditative, etc. As a maker and AMS wonk, I rarely find myself in a meditative state or particularly thinking about someone when I'm making something. I'm often impatient, annoyed, and working through the tedium of some parts of the process. I don't resent the work, but even gifts are sometimes a pain to make. So my question is, why do we so often attribute certain kinds of sweet emotions to the process of making, especially when women are the makers?
That's such a great question. And yeah, I think it speaks to the lived experience of making that is so important to distinguish from this kind of idealization that we often have. My students were especially frustrated with the process of learning that kind of intricate table of Gimp Work designs. But once you master it, it did become this kind of repetitive, not mindless, but it could become kind of a contemplative practice of repetition and recycling. And I think maybe by invoking, or that it is the physical remnant of your loved one that might evoke these kind of meditations on sentiment. Or you're right, it might be this frustration. If you were not especially gifted or talented at it, it might be a source of incredible frustration. And I'm not thinking of the right word. Some sense of guilt about the negative feelings associated with it, I'm assuming. Some sort of resentment at the expectations that you are being asked to put together this kind of family album or this gift. The ways in which you are feeling like you're supposed to measure up to these expectations that society has for you. I think that the darker feelings of any kind of hair work or craft project might absolutely be also embedded in these painstaking, laborious works. So thank you for encouraging me to think about that. I know in my own kind of craft work or mending something, for example, there is a lot of like anxiety and frustration around it. So I think that's a great point, not to idealize necessarily these makers as kind of heroic angels as well.
Martha Willis asks, let me just make sure I didn't skip somebody. Okay. Actually, let me go up to the top. Marty, the chain on Abigail Foster Wood's gravestone looks like a symbol of the Odd Fellows.
Interesting.
So, comment there. And then Martha.
The chain on her husband's gravestone had a very similar chain, but he predeceased her. And so one of the links was left open. So I wonder if some of it was kind of about the ties that bind, or the kind of unfinished sense of their relationship, that he had died, but her love for him lived on. But I'll look into the Oddfellows connection too. Thanks.
Marty Sterling asks, Martha Lewis, what do these works say about women's hairstyles of the time? Long hair, also trying to visualize how hair was organized and preserved while being worked with.
Yeah, so absolutely. Most women of the period had very long hair that was then braided and curled and pinned into really elaborate styles. We saw that portrait for a brief moment of Abigail Foster Wood with her towering hairstyle. And we can think too, though, that then as now, I think a lot of those had artificial help with extensions or little braids or they sometimes called them rats, I think, little collected bunches of hair that would then give a little extra volume to the hair. And in terms of how hair was stored or prepared, the Mark Campbell's self-instructor in the art of hair work suggested that people boil the hair before working with it, which makes sense from kind of a hygiene standpoint, but also makes it even, I think, ups the gross factor again as well. But he suggested that you kind of fasten one end of it so that it would be almost like a wand, I think, of hair in some ways, so that it was stretched out and tried to be made as kind of straight and single-stranded as possible, so that it really was treated as though each individual hair were like a thread, which I am sure the more I am thinking about this, the absolutely more I think about the kind of irritation or frustration that Carla evoked of trying to keep this straight, trying to keep them untangled. People did save their hair from their combs, or if you think about now, combing out your hair and having loose hair at the end, they would keep them in these materials called receivers, and then later kind of sort through and organize them to do this kind of work. I didn't really talk about palette work, but this was another kind of hair work in which you didn't need a long length or chunk of hair. You could arrange the hair into kind of a feather-like shape and affix it to a palette with gum arabic or a kind of glue, so that was often done for a memorial or memento for a man who had shorter hair. And also people made sepia ink, in which the pigment was actually very finely cut hair, almost more like Althea Murphy Price's shavings that you saw on the ground, but they were made into a kind of ink and then painted. So it had the hair without screaming hair necessarily. Does that make sense?
Martha has another question. And what was this a regional craft like New England or practiced more widely?
Yeah, so this is, most people talk about it as originating in Sweden and Germany, and then kind of migrating to the rest of Europe and Britain and the United States. I've focused on Vermont examples just because we have a wonderful array of, in many instances, understudied examples here, and we have the archives that go with them. From what I understand, this was a more widespread practice, but again, like I said, it was really a middle and upper middle class activity of leisure, or people who had the means to ship off your hair and select gold settings and the like from a jeweler for hire. So this was not necessarily limited to New England, but many of the examples that I talked about tonight are from Vermont. Absolutely.
Rachel asks, at what point did hair go from being these beautiful pieces of art to seemingly creepy to some modern sensibilities?
Yeah, I think that some of my fellow hair work enthusiasts have talked about this as kind of linked to the rise of understanding or changing ideas about hygiene and germs and germ theory. And from a decorative arts standpoint, if you think about the picture of the parlor that I showed you and how kind of overstuffed, Casey Greer talks about 19th century furnishings as kind of overstuffed in this way, so that almost all of the chairs and furniture is upholstered and pillowed with lots of pillows and a lot of heavy fabrics, lots of doodads and things like that. And then if you think about Art Deco aesthetics of the 1920s and 1930s, where everything is clean. I'm already prejudicing you against it by using things like clean, but the clean, streamlined design with very few knickknacks, using materials like chrome or tile or mirrored surfaces. Those are all part of a big shift in thinking about what is desirable in an aesthetic interior. The art historian and design historian Christina Cogdell has explicitly linked, she has really amazing research about thinking about 1930s streamlined design as being alarmingly in dialogue with ongoing conversations about eugenics and hygiene, and how all of these kind of value judgments are made about what some people later called the tyranny of bric-a-brac. Though this desire to have clean, dust-free surfaces that could be easily, I started to say fumigated, sanitized. This is seeming very COVID adjacent as well. But part of that shift, and in terms of aesthetics and collecting, these objects they were seen as old-fashioned and fussy and dusty, and in many instances for a lot of antique dealers, these weird artifacts that were so painstakingly made that were emblematic of family ties, of affection, and kind of far-flung people coming together, reunited in this wreath, it didn't have that resonance to someone who wasn't related to them. And so in many instances, or in some instances, some antique dealers tossed the artifacts in the shadow boxes and kept the frames and reused them for other things. So thus further separating the names of the makers or the family from that. So we've kind of lost it. But yeah, at the point in which people thought, oh, Victorian stuff is so old-fashioned and dusty and seems more fitting for a haunted house than my comfortable home sphere, that seems to be a big turning point. And I think, like I said, evokes these bigger questions about, germs and cleanliness and aesthetics more broadly.
Jessica asks, I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the different ways hair was used in this period, how this commemorative practice differs from natural history, ethnography, specimens, and its presentation and use.
Yeah, that's exciting. In the 19th century, people were definitely thinking about hair as a racial marker in this particular moment and collected it as they did. This also opens into broader questions about kind of scientific racism and pseudoscientific theories about hierarchies of race and what were thought of as essential qualities of different, categorizing different races of mankind that they were thinking about. And yeah, there's a way in which this, because it is a women's craft and is one that was mostly practiced by white ladies, it becomes kind of imbricated in everyday culture. Whereas at the time period, absolutely, as you suggest, ethnographic museums, natural history museums were collecting what they saw as representations of different racial types. And that included making plaster casts of people's facial features, but also collecting skulls in really distressing, disrespectful handling of human remains. And the British Museum of Natural History included hair in its ethnographic collections as well. Absolutely. I remember reading about it especially mentioned the long pigtail, it described it, of a Chinese man. The Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia has a huge collection of specimens of hair by a scientist. The curious collection of Peter A. Brown, who was obsessed with hair, or as he sometimes called it, pile, as a way of understanding species differences. So he included the hair and fur of animals, like you can see here, in these collections of pile, but also the hair of famous individuals, in which case he would often ask for an autograph. He would include a portrait of the person and a specimen of their hair. So this was seen as carrying, again, this kind of essential aspect of the person by having a fragment of their very being, of their body. So you're seeing some more of that here. So, right, for elite, educated white men, this became about individuality and a sign of their essence, their person that coordinated with their handwriting and their portrait and their own intellectual identity. But if it were for people of other races, it often was then about the identity of the entire ethnic or racial category, which reflects most of the attitudes of the time. But yeah, this raises a really interesting question. Collecting the hair of famous people. Someone working at the Smithsonian was collecting all the hair of all of the presidents as much as he could. Raises real questions about who gets to have individualized identity and who is reduced to a type or this whole swath of an identity category. Sorry, I think I went on for a really long time there, but it's a provocative question. Thank you.
Utopia asks, can you address the idea of ritual and relationship of making hair work? Is there a relationship ancient humans developed and divined ritual and ritualized behavior? Some rituals and ceremonies done by men only, some by women only. Were women making hair work performing ritual or ritualized behavior, a modern version of their day? Did the making and gifting satisfy because it was a ritual and personal ceremony?
Yeah, this is so provocative too. I'm not an anthropologist, and so don't necessarily have that kind of vocabulary or training to think about or articulate the ways in which that I think fulfilled this function. But this absolutely was often part of a rite of passage. I mentioned young women leaving their homes to marry and join a new family. In some instances, it was about kind of like exchanging people might exchange friendship bracelets when I was a kid, or now I think that's happening again. You might write in one another's yearbooks, if we think about it that as a kind of ritual. Exchanging locks of hair and signing your name in a friendship album was one of the rituals of kind of girlhood, womanhood, a way of establishing your community and your network of people you were important to and who were important to you. And I think in many instances, it was many people exchanged those locks or saved those locks of hair. We might think now about the ritual of baby's first haircut. If those of you are keeping baby books or have your own baby book, that is a ritual and one of the few kind of established ways in which we keep hair today. But I think in the moment or in the 19th century, probably a lot of people saved hair intending to make some of these really elaborate works, and then it just stayed in an envelope and was never realized. So I think there's a way in which our understanding has shifted over time, and the ways in which we think about kind of a talisman to bring back the kind of anthropology language, the ways in which we think about identity or personhood as embedded in these artifacts of the person's body that we love or care for, is absolutely has this kind of elemental aspect to it, which we now might couch in the language of DNA, of scientific genetic understanding, that, oh, this has the kind of archetype, all of the information or data that makes the person who they are, versus a language of sentiment, or kind of essence, if that makes sense. I've again gone
on. That looks like, and Jessica said, thank you for the answer. It was fantastic. So yeah, I think that's it for questions, and they were fantastic questions. So thank you, everybody who shared their thoughts and questions. That was fantastic. This was wonderful.
Thank you so much, Wendy.